Of all the verdicts examined in this book, the least disputable, admittedly, is that on Norman Thorne. His trial was a model of dignity and fairness. He was finely defended by a notable defender. The issues and the evidence were handled by the judge in a manner that drew praise from the Court of Criminal Appeal. And indeed, it is highly probable that, in convicting Thorne of murder, the jury did no more than register the truth. But a high degree of probability is not to be equated with sufficient legal proof, and study of this case makes one inclined to wonder whether the Crown did not fall a fraction short of discharging the heavy onus that rightly lies upon it. On Friday, December 5th, 1924, Elsie Cameron, a young London typist living with her parents, set off for Crowborough to see her sweetheart Norman Thorne. She bought her ticket, passed through the barrier, found a seat in a third-class carriage, put her cheap little attaché case on the rack above her head, and settled herself down for the short journey, mercifully unaware that it was the last she would make on earth. The expedition was not prompted by romantic passion, though Elsie Cameron was very much in love. At the moment, practical matters occupied her mind. She and Thorne had been engaged since 1922. For more than a year there had been signs that he was cooling. Lately, he had even written of another girl. Now Elsie Cameron believed that she was pregnant by him, a state of affairs which would not brook vacillation or delay. She was going to Crowborough to claim her rights, to insist that her fiancé should marry her at once. It was an anxious, overwrought, but above all determined girl that drummed her fingers on the rough upholstery and watched the bleak winter landscape rolling by. Several days passed. Elsie Cameron did not come home, neither did she write. Her family's surprise soon turned to deep concern, and on the following Wednesday, her father wired to Thorne. "Elsie left Friday. Have heard no news, reply." Thorne wired back at once. "Not here, open letters, can't understand." The letters in question were duly opened. There were 2 of them, each written by Thorne, each posted in Crowborough, each addressed to Elsie at her London home. "Well," asked the first, "where did you get to yesterday? I went to Groombridge, and you did not turn up. I was expecting a letter today," said the second, in mild but perceptible accents of reproach, "especially after not seeing you and not hearing from you." The dates upon these letters confirmed the distracted parents in their fears. Thorne, it appeared, had written them to Elsie days after they had supposed that she was with him. In yet a further letter, following up his telegram, Thorne shattered their last lingering hope of some misunderstanding. As it sets forth the substance of a story and conveys the essence of an attitude, both of which he maintained during the subsequent 6 weeks, this letter merits quotation in full. "Dear Mrs. Cameron, I have reread the telegram over and over again, and it has given me quite a shock. I presume from that Elsie left home on Friday. She wrote to me asking me to meet her at Groombridge on Saturday morning. I went, but she did not turn up, and I take it something had prevented her at the last moment. I have been expecting a letter from her all the week and wondering why I did not hear. Apparently she has been gone 6 days now, and no delay must be made in making inquiries. Send particulars of how she was dressed. I will try and get what information I can locally. It is an awful position, and I fear the worst. What time did she leave and by what train? Why did she not write and say she was coming? I cannot write any more, as needless to say I am very worried and upset. With love to all, yours truly, Norman." There was hardly a word of truth in this document. The telegram had not come as a shock to Norman Thorne. He had no need to deduce the day when Elsie left her home, or surmise why she did not present herself on Saturday. He knew the reason for her unaccustomed silence. He knew how many days, how many hours, she had been gone. And as for her garments, he had had ample opportunity to study them in detail when he burnt them in his grate. But all this was a secret locked in his own breast, where he intended that it should remain. The Camerons, left without a clue to guide them in the mystery, reported the disappearance of their daughter to the police. Investigation into the whereabouts of a missing person is seldom restricted to the immediate physical facts. Character, background, and personal relations Point out the paths where inquiry should prove fruitful. What was in the missing person's mind? Where would he want to go? What would he want to do? The answer, which may be critically important, can only be sought in the individual's history. The history of Elsie Cameron was slowly pieced together. Bit by bit, the whole sad, tawdry business came to light. The courtship, the betrothal, the tentative attempts by Thorne to wriggle free, the girl's inflexible resolve to hold her man. They had met, this hapless couple, under pious auspices, where the cold flame of Wesley casts its light on Kensal Green. Elsie was plain, fragile, inclined to introspection. Thorne was strong, healthy, good-looking in his way. What drew them together is not subject to analysis. One can only set on record that the formula did its work and held them in bond for a short, uneasy space. Bad luck dogged them from the very start. In the slump, Thorne lost his job as engineer. Debilitated nerves kept Elsie unemployed. Throughout their engagement, they were woefully short of cash. Thorne's reaction at least showed enterprise. He turned his back upon the engineering trade and, with a small sum borrowed from his father, took a plot of land at Crowborough and began a chicken farm. But the farm failed to prosper. He lived there by himself in a hut, 12 feet by 7, primitive, cramped, squalid beyond thought. Even so, Elsie refused to be discouraged. "We can manage in a hut like yours," she wrote, and urged the hesitating bachelor to marry. At every stage it is clear the girl had made the pace, and the man had, in any given circumstance, recoiled. They were, in fact, a fundamentally ill-assorted pair, possessing nothing in common except a habit of chapel-going and the prospect of privation. The other girl's appearance on the scene was an overt symptom of this underlying trouble. If no other girl had ever materialized, if the path of love had technically run smooth, the match would still have ended up in tragedy. It might have been a tragedy of the gradual wearing sort. Resentful husband and disillusioned wife, unable or afraid to break their irksome ties. As it was, it turned into a tragedy of violence, where the pressure would not yield without the sacrifice of life. Thorne had met the other girl about 6 months before. She lived nearby. Elsie Cameron had seen her once when she was staying at Crowborough, but does not appear to have regarded her as a potential rival. Such confidence was misplaced. Affection soon matured between the other girl and Thorne. Presently she took to visiting him at night, and local gossip had it that there was something going on. Elsie remained in blissful ignorance of this, and might so have continued but for Thorne himself. He deliberately chose to reveal his double-dealing, but one may be sure not at conscience's dictate. His confession was significantly timed. It was fired back as a counter to reports of Elsie's pregnancy, and was manifestly meant to stave off the immediate marriage for which his fiancée now more than ever pressed. Thus, he had written to her on November 25th. "You seem to be taking everything for granted. There are 1 or 2 things I haven't told you for more reasons than one. It concerns someone else as well. I'm afraid I am between 2 fires." Perhaps Elsie's attention was fixed on other things. Perhaps she closed her eyes to what she did not want to see. Her reply, which was by return, had expressed merely bewilderment. "Really, Norman, your letter puzzles me. I can't make it out. Why are there 1 or 2 things you haven't told me, and in what way does it concern someone else? What do you mean by, you are afraid you are between 2 fires? Oh, I don't understand things at all." Dismissing her lover's cryptic utterances, she had reverted to the theme that monopolized and obsessed her. "Well, Norman, please arrange about getting married as soon as possible. I feel sick every day, and things will soon be noticeable to everybody, and I want to be married before Christmas, and Christmas Day is only a month from tomorrow. Please do get married quickly." Willfully or guilelessly, she had not construed his meaning. He must make it plainer, so plain, so simple, and so unequivocal that there would be no room for misinterpretation. On the 27th, he had written to her again. "What I haven't told you is that on certain occasions a girl has been here late at night. I'm not going to mention her name. Nobody knows. When you gave in to your nerves again and refused to take interest in life, I gave up hope in you and let myself go. This is the result. I didn't know last week what I know now. I must have time to think. She thinks I am going to marry her, of course, and I have a strong feeling for her. Or I shouldn't have done what I have. Now, was that straight enough? Not an ambiguous sentence in it, except, I didn't know last week what I know now. And surely even Elsie would grasp the drift of that. She had grasped it, fully. Her next letter, again by return of post, was a genuine cry of anguish. You have absolutely broken my heart. I never thought you were capable of such deception. So I am to take it that you have got this other girl into the same condition which you have got me? But if Thorne had expected her outraged feelings to turn her from the project upon which she was set, he was doomed to disappointment. She reiterated her demand with emphasis. Your duty is to marry me. I have first claim on you. I expect you to marry me and finish with the other girl as soon as possible. My baby must have a name, and another thing, I love you in spite of all. It is an ironical feature of this correspondence that neither allegation of pregnancy was true. Elsie Cameron's was honest but mistaken. Thorne's was a calculated lie. But that had not been known to Elsie Cameron when she started off to Crowborough and vanished into space. She saw herself confronting a desperate situation. A baby on the way, another girl in the same plight, Thorne torn between the two, and her rival being on the spot holding the advantage. Was it not natural? Was it not inevitable that this girl, who had at all times been clamoring for marriage, should hurry to the man by whom her fate was being decided? The more the police found out, and the more they thought about it, the more they were driven to work from this conclusion. That nothing bar a catastrophe of the greatest magnitude would have sufficed to divert Elsie Cameron from her goal. But Thorne stood in the way of this hypothesis. He steadfastly affirmed that she had not come to the farm, that he had not set eyes on her, that he did not know where she was. He behaved, too, exactly as a person should behave who is innocently suffering the torments of suspense. He wandered restlessly about with a troubled, harassed air, appearing to seek comfort in discussion with his neighbors. He canvassed the opinion of everyone he met, while frequently expressing his own melancholy forebodings. He was touchingly eager to assist with the inquiry, and bombarded the police with little scraps of information. All in all, observing it in retrospect, his acting through this period was consummately skilled. One thing robbed his bravura of its full effect. Two nurserymen came forward, one of whom at least knew Elsie Cameron by sight. They had been passing Thorne's gate, they said, on the evening of the 5th, and had seen Elsie Cameron going towards the farm. It seemed very odd, and they might both be mistaken, but of course the police could not afford to disregard this hint. Thorne was asked if he objected to an inspection of his farm, and at once spoke to the contrary with something like enthusiasm. "I'm glad you're coming," he said, "to clear the matter up." A superintendent and an inspector went over the farm, looked into the huts, and found no trace of the girl. Before they left, they took a statement from the owner. "She did not come here," Thorne again assured them, "and I have not seen or heard from her." It was tempting to discount the nurserymen. It was tempting to accept the word of Norman Thorne. Who could be better entitled to belief? His character was unblemished, his record clear. He taught at Sunday school, worked for temperance societies, and spoke on occasion for the Band of Hope. No one could breathe a word to his discredit. Besides, if Thorne was wrong and the nurserymen were right, where was Elsie Cameron now? Come to think of it, that was the very thing they didn't know. Meanwhile, the public had grown intensely interested in Elsie Cameron's fate. It was almost a matter of principle. You could vanish without trace, no doubt, in the Sahara Desert or the Australian bush or the upper reaches of the Amazon. But not between Kensal Green and Crowborough, not in the close-knit network of communities that was southern England, not where a highly trained, expensive staff of police guarded the safety of the humblest citizen. It might be good news or bad, it might be life or death, it might be fair play or foul, but don't tell us that the woman can't be found. So Britain grumbled, and police efforts redoubled. A crack from Scotland Yard went down to help the Sussex force, but December passed, and January began its chilly cycle. and still they had made no appreciable advance. Already Elsie Cameron was like some figure in a myth. Her name was familiar, her story known, but her existence half forgotten. The case was approaching the edge of that abyss below which lies the limbo of mysteries unsolved. Then, on January 1st, came the turning point. Like so many turning points, in other fields besides detection, it did not appear outstandingly important in itself. It was merely that a Crowborough lady, who, one must conclude, saw newspapers but seldom, read for the first time a full account of Elsie's disappearance. She meditated on this singular event, so closely linked with local folk and places. Thorne's farm, she'd passed it more times than she could count. Whenever she went to visit Mrs. Tester, she walked along that road right by his gate. She had been to Mrs. Tester's, too, somewhere about the time they said this girl had vanished. Early in December it was, wasn't it? On a Friday afternoon. The first Friday afternoon? The first. And it all came back to her. Of course, on her way home that evening, shortly after 5, she had seen a young woman entering Thorne's farm. An ordinary young woman. Nothing to distinguish her. One thing, though, she was carrying an attaché case. It was, in a sense, only the shadow of a story. She couldn't describe the person she had seen. She couldn't say she answered to Elsie Cameron's description. Being absolutely honest, she couldn't say more than that she had seen a girl in that place at that time. But the police now had 3 people, all of whom were saying that they had seen a girl in that place at that time. Sunday school and Band of Hope and Temperance notwithstanding, Thorne must be subjected to a further final test. No one could complain that this test was not rigorous, nor that, in the event, the rigor was unjustified. At 3:30 in the afternoon of January 14th, Chief Inspector Gillen of the yard, together with other officers, arrived at the farm where he found Thorne in his hut. Gillen explained in time-honored phrases that he was making inquiries into Elsie Cameron's disappearance on December 5th, and that he had reason to believe she had been seen alive there on the evening of that day. Thorne was unshaken. "I have heard remarks to that effect," he said, "but I don't believe them." Gillen told him that he proposed to search. Thorne offered his assistance. Gillen asked him whether he would make a further statement. Thorne readily agreed. Gillen then suggested that, as accommodation was lacking in the hut, they might adjourn to the station and take the statement there. It might be thought that, however scanty its facilities, the living hut was at least equipped to fulfill this simple function. There were writing materials, there was a table, there were chairs. But perhaps Gillen was right, for this was to be a colossus, a mammoth, a marathon among statements. They began on it at 8 o'clock that night, Thorne talking, a sergeant writing, Gillen breaking off and coming back as other work allowed. When they finished, it was 3:30 next morning, and a tired chief inspector gazed on the fruit of their joint labors, an amplified re-echo of what Thorne had said before. But meanwhile, the new search was getting underway. Once again, a squad of police descended on the farm, pledged to explore every inch for Elsie Cameron. This time they carried spades. At 8:04 on the morning of January 15th, one of the policemen digging at the farm turned up an attaché case which had been buried near the gate. Inside it were a jumper, some shoes, and a broken pair of spectacles. The part which Thorne had so far played with flawless plausibility was exposed in that instant as a fake and a sham. The gathering storm now broke over his head, and it raged with unremitting fury till it had destroyed him. In the station cell where he was now confined, Thorne spent the day pondering his next step. When Gillen had told him he would be detained, and probably charged with Elsie Cameron's murder, he had held his peace and uttered not a word. But Thorne was no fool. He must have known that his game of wide-eyed innocence was up. What could he put in place of all those lies that had served to shield him for so many weeks? A different fiction, or the naked truth? Which of the two he chose will never be known, certainly. But by the evening he had made up his mind. He asked to see Gillen, and when that officer appeared, announced, "I want to tell you the truth of what took place." The words are no criterion. They are common form when a suspect changes tune. And so another statement, the last and most important, made its laborious way towards the prisoner's file. Again, Thorne talked. Again, the sergeant wrote. Again, the chief inspector watchfully presided. But they no longer spoke and wrote and listened to soothing words of virtuous denial. Instead, there was unfolded a tale so grisly that it sent a thrill of horror pulsating through the land. Elsie Cameron, said Thorne, had indeed come to the farm on December 5th. She had walked into his living hut at tea time, taking him completely by surprise. She told him she intended sleeping in the hut and, moreover, staying till she was married. An argument had opened up at once. It continued on and off for several hours till the last London train had gone and Elsie's persistence had temporarily prevailed. Thorne was then in an uncomfortable dilemma. Earlier on, before Elsie's sudden advent, he had made an appointment to meet the other girl. At 9:30, as the hour was drawing near, he told Elsie this and made ready to go. She protested, he insisted, and on this occasion the advantage lay with him. He kept his appointment, leaving her behind him in the hut. He was away about 2 hours. In simple, shocking words, he depicted his return. When I opened the hut door, I saw Miss Cameron hanging from a beam that supports the roof by a piece of cord as used for the washing line. I cut the cord and laid her on the bed. She was dead. I then put out the lights. She had her frock off and her hair was down. I lay across the table for about an hour. I was about to go to Dr. Turle and knock up someone to go for the police, and I realized the position I was in, and decided not to do so. I then went down to the workshop. I got my hacksaw and some sacks, and took them back to the hut. I took off Miss Cameron's clothes and burned them in the fireplace in the hut. I then laid the sacks on the floor, put Miss Cameron, who was then naked, on the floor, and sawed off her legs and the head by the glow of the fire. I put them in sacks, intending to carry them away, but my nerve failed me, and I took them down to the workshop and I left them there. I went back to the hut and sat in the chair all night. Next morning, just as it got light, I buried the sacks and a tin containing the remains in a chicken run. It is the Leghorn chicken run, the first pen from the gate. The sergeant laid down his pen. The statement was read out. Coolly, Thorne affixed his signature. Chief Inspector Gillen's face was grim. He had solved one problem, only to raise another. The case of Elsie Cameron was over. The case of Norman Thorne had just begun. Important trials are usually held in important places, in London or in one of the large provincial cities, but there are occasional exceptions. Several small towns still enjoy, by ancient heritage, the periodic pomp and pageantry of assize. And now and again high drama visits one of these quiet spots in the shape of a trial that sets all England by the ears. It happened in 1921 at Carmarthen, when they tried Harold Greenwood, and crowds lined the streets to watch counsel going to court. It happened in 1922 at Hereford, when they tried Herbert Armstrong, and those who failed to get into the building patiently waited in the snow outside. It happened in 1924 at Guildford, when they tried the volatile, spade-bearded Vacquier. It happened in 1925 at Lewes, when they tried Norman Thorne. Throughout the 5 days of the battle for Thorne's life, Lewes was in a ferment of unwholesome curiosity. It is hardly fair, though, to blame the town itself for that. Norman Thorne was the talk of the whole country, and people flocked from near and far as to some prize entertainment. After all, even if you weren't one of the lucky ones who gained a seat in court, there were several fascinating ways of filling time. Celebrity spotting, slandering the witnesses, gaping and goggling at the broken-hearted parents, and, most agreeable diversion of them all, booing and jibing at the other girl. This lamentable atmosphere encompassing the courthouse was never permitted to penetrate within. That was assured from the outset by the character of the lawyers in whose hands the conduct of proceedings mainly lay. There was to be neither the weakness on the bench that prejudiced Mrs. Maybrick's trial, nor the disorder at the bar that so disfigured Steiny Morrison's trial. Mr. Justice Finlay was as clear-headed and capable as he was self-effacing. Sir Henry Curtis Bennet, Chief Prosecuting Counsel, was as impartial in this role as he could be fervent when a defender. And J.D. Castles, who had accepted the brief for Thorne, was almost the prototype of modern criminal advocates. Economy and point were his watchwords. Verbiage and barnstorming he alike eschewed. The lines of Castle's plea were predetermined. Thorne's last statement did not admit of an alternative. "When I opened the hut door, I saw Miss Cameron hanging." Those were the words that governed the defense. They pointed not to murder, but to suicide, or at the very least, to death from shock in the attempt. And if that was once accepted, all the rest could be explained. The concealment, the lies, and even the dissection could then be attributed to overwhelming fear. A fear not unnatural in a man who quickly realized that appearances were against him and that he was likely to be blamed. I thought of the letters I had written. I remembered I had been telling people that I wanted to break the engagement. I remembered that it was known that another girl had been coming down to me and I had been walking out with her. In view of these things, I became afraid. These were Thorne's words when he went into the box, and one cannot deny them considerable force. So the real battle in the trial of Norman Thorne was a battle to discover how Elsie Cameron died. If, as the defense was to maintain, she had died from shock while trying to hang herself, Thorne, whatever his conduct afterwards, was not guilty of murder and entitled to go free. If, on the contrary, she had in fact been murdered, the jury could have no doubt who her murderer was. Suicide isn't everybody's exploit. The majority of people go through the world without ever seriously contemplating self-destruction. Human capacity for suffering is immense, even more so in the female than the male. Pangs of jealousy, faithlessness of lovers, the prospect of social dishonor and disgrace, such agonizing tortures are endured and survived by millions of young women in every generation. Only the neurotic prove unequal to the strain. That Elsie Cameron was neurotic had been evident to her intimates. It was Cassell's task to make it evident to the jury. Much of his work on the first day of the trial was directed to this end. Scores of questions, skillfully placed and timed, ultimately united to compose a telling picture. A picture of Elsie at home, at work, at Crowborough, often depressed, sometimes hysterical, always plagued and harried by her nerves. Her father, who was the first witness of substance, agreed that she had left employment because of nerve trouble, that on one occasion office colleagues accompanied her home because her nerves were bad, that she had been treated by doctors, both in London and Crowborough, for nerves. Did it ever come to your knowledge, Cassels asked him, that she had been brought from Crowborough to Victoria Station by the prisoner? Yes, Mr. Cameron said. Did your other daughter meet her? Yes. Did your other daughter make any communication to you about a message she had had from the prisoner? Yes. Was the communication that your daughter Elsie had threatened to throw herself out of the train? Something to that effect, Mr. Cameron admitted. Presently, Cassels handed up a letter, and the witness identified the writing as his wife's. I put that letter in, my lord, Cassels said, and the letter, thus formally introduced in evidence, was read out to the jury by the clerk of assize. Dated December 16th, it was addressed to Norman Thorne. The suspense is terrible, it said. We get no rest, night or day. If it had been a week or two ago, I should have thought she might have done something rash, poor girl. That, then, was how Elsie had appeared to her own parents. Acquaintances in Crowborough had formed similar opinions. One, with whom she had lodged from time to time, spoke of her being nervy and brooding over things. Another had remarked, soon after her disappearance, that there was no telling what might happen to a person who got so low. Castle's cross-examination brought all these things to light. That first evening, when the court adjourned and each man went his way, the barristers to their mess, the judge to the stately solitude of his lodging, the prisoner to his cell, that evening saw Thorne's chances reach their highest mark. On the record up to December 5th, he was not a likely murderer. Elsie Cameron was a not unlikely suicide. This, in itself, did not constitute a case. It merely laid the foundations of a case. Suicide was possible, yes, but had it really happened? The second day's hearing was largely taken up by the Crown's attempts to show that it had not, to dispose of any theories that might tend to show it had. and to prove beyond that reasonable doubt which every prisoner lawfully invokes, that Elsie Cameron had lost her life under the violence of another's hand. The method used was necessarily oblique. Of that dark and angry evening in the hut, Thorne was the sole survivor. The only eyewitness beside himself had been carefully buried underneath his farm, but the remains of that poor girl, divided and stowed away exactly as Thorne said, had been dug up, scrutinized, analyzed, interred, dug up, scrutinized, and analyzed again. The tale that Elsie Cameron did not live to tell, pathologists sought to read upon her decomposing flesh. Speaking broadly, there are three kinds of evidence: direct, circumstantial, and expert. It is direct evidence when one man says he saw a second plunge a dagger into the vitals of a third. It is circumstantial evidence when the knife of a lover is found, stained with blood, by the stabbed corpse of his mistress. But when test tubes are mobilized and microscopes unleashed, when crimes are reconstructed and assaults revisualized, when the testimony of onlookers is scornfully swept aside by reference to a shred of skin or a dented metal bar, then the experts have descended on the scene. Each kind of evidence in turn can be disparaged. Eyewitnesses may lie, circumstances may deceive, experts may lack learning, err in observation, be faulty in logic or dogmatic in conclusions. Occasionally an expert has contrived to be all four. Genuine experts, though, make few mistakes of fact. Disputes between them are generally confined to the interpretation that acknowledged facts should bear. In other words, they differ in opinion. The experts in the Thorne case differed in opinion. A distinguished corps assembled at Lewis for the trial, and it was they who were to be the principal protagonists. The real expert evidence, which was wholly scientific, followed semi-expert evidence on the subject of the beams. There were two beams straddling the little living hut. If Thorne's story were true, Elsie Cameron must have hanged herself with a piece of washing line secured to one of these. Her physique, of course, was slight. She weighed only 8 stone, but the suspension, and still more, the jerk, might well have left a mark or nick on the beam that took the strain. 3 days after Norman Thorne's arrest, Gillen, accompanied by an aide from Scotland Yard, had been to the hut with this idea in mind. They observed no mark on either of the beams. Then they conducted 2 experiments with an 8-stone weight fastened to the beams by a length of washing line. First, the weight was slowly raised and swung. Next, it was placed upon a chair, which was kicked away to cause a sudden jerk. Both these experiments were said to have caused marks, which Gillen pointed out when the beams were exhibited in court. No marks before the tests, marks as a result of the tests. The deduction invited was dangerously simple, that no comparable weight could have swung from there before. There was some disagreement about the marks themselves, about the character of the cord, about the possible effect of a knot in the wood. But the defense's sharpest impact upon this part of the case was packed into 2 questions, which Cassels put to Gillen. Was anyone present representing the defense when your experiments took place? No, the chief inspector said. Had the defense any notice of the fact that you were making the experiments? No, the chief inspector said. The effect of this admission ought to have been great. Experiments of the kind described depend on tiny details: the balancing of the weight, the adjustment of the cord, the direction in which the chair is kicked away. Exclusion of the defense from even passive participation was a considerable police error, conducing to offend a sagacious jury's sense of right and fitness. But how far did the Thorne jury merit this description? That is impossible to say. A jury that must perforce sit silent till passing judgment with a simple yea or nay preserves its secrets as no prisoner can. The latter faces a twofold exposure: by the willing tongues of others and by the loosening of his own. He cannot hope to pass wholly unscathed. Some part at least of his soul will be stripped bare. But a jury, every jury, is protected and remote and remains a complete enigma for all time. It would be foolish, then, to set at naught the evidence of the beams, since we cannot be sure that the jury did likewise. But one may justifiably guess that it very soon sank into the background of their thoughts. The beams were no more than a penny whistle overture, soon to be drowned in the crashing chords of the mighty one-man orchestra on which the crown relied. That orchestra dispensed a dance of death, scored and conducted with diabolic brilliance. In almost every big trial, there is a moment of transcendent crisis. A moment, as in Priestley's Dangerous Corner, that determines by remote control all the events to follow. It may come early or late. It may burst unheralded or have been long foreseen. The crisis in the trial of Norman Thorne occurred on the second afternoon, and it took the shape unanimously expected. Everyone in court and millions elsewhere had been waiting breathlessly upon the time when Sir Bernard Spilsbury would get up from his place and walk with calm assurance to the box. Spilsbury was the Crown's sole expert witness. The defense had 4 or 5, at least 3 of whom could boast qualifications on a par with Spilsbury's own. They agreed between themselves and disagreed with him so that the defense enjoyed an easy lead on a mere counting of heads. How then did Spilsbury's evidence acquire such vast importance? Why was it being said by those conversant with the courts that, unless he were completely smashed in cross-examination, Spilsbury's opinion was certain to prevail? The answer is simple. Juries are formed from members of the public, and the British public believed Spilsbury infallible. Spilsbury had indeed done what few can hope to do. He had become a legend in his own lifetime. To the man in the street, he stood for pathology, as Hobbes stood for cricket or Dempsey for boxing or Capablanca for chess. By the middle 20s, he had achieved a status merited by none, not even by himself. His pronouncements were invested with the force of dogma, and it was blasphemy to hint he might conceivably be wrong. This situation was not of Spilsbury's seeking. It arose partly because, as Home Office pathologist, he was constantly appearing in the most sensational cases, partly because his qualities were genuinely outstanding. Even so, it was a situation fraught with danger. As Cassels was to say in his final speech for Thorne, we can all admire attainment. Take off our hats to ability. Acknowledge the high position that a man has won in his sphere. But it is a long way to go if you have to say that. When that man says something, there can be no room for error. It is a long way to go, far beyond the territories of reason. But many a jury had gone that way before, and none knew better than Cassels himself how grave was the danger they would go that way again. Spilsbury answered Curtis Bennett's questions in his own easy but authoritative style. Always matter-of-fact and unemotional, he spoke not as a champion of a cause, but rather as an objective scientist announcing his conclusions. His courtesy, though, did not obscure the fact that he regarded these conclusions as indisputable. Spilsbury's evidence in chief was damning against Thorne. He had examined the remains of Elsie Cameron, taken measurements, made slides, peered at them through magnifiers. He told the jury what he had observed. 8 bruises on the head, face, arms, and legs, all of them inflicted shortly before death, and one, on the temple, caused by a crushing blow. One of those might have done it, Spilsbury said, referring to a pair of Indian clubs that the police had picked up outside Thorne's living hut. Spilsbury also told the jury things he had noted by their absence, signs of asphyxiation and scars or grooving in the neck, such as I should be certain to find if the woman had been hanged. How, then, in his view, did Elsie Cameron die? From shock. Shock due to the combined effect of all the bruises. I found nothing else to account for death, said the Crown expert oracularly. And if Sir Bernard Spilsbury could find nothing else, what else could there be? The effect of this was clear. There had been no hanging and no suicide. Somebody had attacked the girl and injured her so badly that she died. Such an assumption would be fatal for the defense. Cassels could not afford to let it stand. Spilsbury did not make a habit of retraction. So the famous advocate and the famous expert prepared to cross sharp swords, while Thorne, who knew the truth, sat quiet as a spectator. Cross-examining a man like Spilsbury calls for special gifts. He is not only an expert in the technique of pathology, he is also an expert in the technique of giving evidence. He is not only a professional lecturer and theorist, he is also a professional cross-examinee. He is as used as any counsel to the atmosphere of courts, as trained in the rules, as familiar with the tricks. The bar thus forfeits its customary advantage and joins battle with him on strictly level terms. Half the art of cross-examination resides in knowing what not to ask. Cassell's questioning of Spilsbury was, in this respect, a model. Seldom did the pathologist get a chance to enlarge, expand, or re-emphasize his views. There was no direct attack on a broad front. With infinite delicacy, Cassell's moved one small step at a time, sometimes at this point, sometimes at that, consolidating instantly after an advance, covering up and switching in face of a repulse. It was not showy. The sensation-seekers in the gallery may even have found it dull. But those who care for true forensic skill could seek no sounder exercise in craftsmanship. The first major issue raised was that of the bruises. In no case, Cassell's asked, did you find a breaking of the skin? No. Would you think it possible that a heavy club like that, Cassell's made play with one of the Indian clubs, could produce bruises and yet not break the skin? Oh, certainly, said Spilsbury. It depends upon the part of the body, of course. Take the bruise on the temple. Do you think it possible for that bruise to have been produced with that instrument upon that part of the face? May I show you? Spilsbury said. The club was handed to him. Used this way, and striking that, it would produce the bruise without breaking the skin. He demonstrated from the box. The Indian club swished murderously. The sound of words was momentarily replaced by the sight of action. Such moments in a courtroom have the vivid glare of lightning, and Cassell's made full use of the impression thus produced. For the purpose of that answer, are you assuming a blow with force? Certainly. Was the bone unbroken? Yes. With such an article as that, the weight alone is sufficient, is it not, to break the skin? Certainly not. If it were to drop, say, 3 feet onto wood, wouldn't it produce a considerable dent? It would. And yet you think it might produce that bruise on the human face without breaking either the skin or the bone? Only on certain parts of the face, of course. It will be noted that, though Spilsbury had given nothing away, Cassell's had nonetheless improved his position. The questions had been framed to bring out the inconsistencies, apparent or real, in Spilsbury's hypothesis. Cassell's now foreshadowed his alternative. The defense would contend, and their experts would affirm, that the bruises on the body were consistent with a fall. Their hypothesis was that Thorne returned to the hut just before Elsie died, and that she sustained the bruises as he cut her down. No conceivable expenditure of time or energy would ever make Spilsbury subscribe to this. It would mean utterly repudiating all that he had said. But minor reconciliations might be effected between the contradictory points of view. Treading warily as ever, Cassell's sounded out the ground. The bruise which you found under the left eye, is that as consistent with a fall as with a blow? Yes, Spilsbury conceded, it might possibly have been caused by a fall. And the one at the back of the head, that is much more likely to be the injury produced by a fall. Cassell's had taken the 2 safest examples. He prudently refrained from putting further specific instances and instead asked a portmanteau question shrewdly designed to capitalize his gains. So several of the bruises might have been caused by falling and striking a hard surface? There was but one answer to this. Spilsbury said yes. Cassell's crept a little further forward. The fall that produced the bruise under the left eye, would it be a heavy fall? It must have been. The fall that produced the bruise at the back of the head, would that be a heavy fall? Yes. It was modest progress, but not unsatisfactory. Many able counsel grappling with Spilsbury have found themselves forced back behind their starting place. You found no injuries to the hands? No. Nor the forearms? No. Another scoring point. Its virtue is apparent if one pictures how a woman would instinctively defend herself. To have pressed Spilsbury harder, though, on the subject of the bruises would have been to incur an unwarrantable risk. The other half of the art of cross-examination resides in knowing exactly when to stop. In any event, Cassell's hardest task still lay ahead. While both sides agreed upon shock as the cause of death, they did not agree upon the cause of shock. The defense case rested on an attempt at hanging, a supposition that Spilsbury had pooh-poohed. Once again, there could be no thought of converting the Crown expert, only of inducing him to qualify his assertions. Using every resource of experience and talent, Cassell's embarked on this unhopeful venture. "You found the cause of death, shock?" Spilsbury assented, quickly adding, "Shock due to injuries." "Did you find anything to demonstrate the cause of death as shock, or did you arrive at that conclusion because you could find no other cause?" "It is conclusion," said Spilsbury pontifically. "It must be so." This was not one of his most ingratiating replies. Cassels followed up. "Finding no other cause of death on the post-mortem examination, the conclusion which you arrived at, I am not contesting it, is that death was due to shock." "Yes," Spilsbury said. These, he knew, were preliminary passes. He was all vigilance for the thrust itself. "Can you get death from shock in an attempt at hanging?" This time the approach was naked and direct. "No," Spilsbury answered. "I do not think you can." "Why not?" "Because the attempt at hanging is an asphyxial condition, and death occurs from that." Deliberately or otherwise, this begged the question. Cassels, smoothly polite, declined to be put off. "That is when death occurs from hanging." "Yes. I'm asking you to deal with death occurring from shock due to an attempt at hanging." Spilsbury closed with the problem. "I don't believe death could occur instantly from an attempt at hanging. You get pressure on the neck, don't you?" "Yes." "A very delicate part of the human frame?" "Yes." "Containing the means whereby the communications pass from the brain to the rest of the body?" "Yes." "Have you considered the effect of such circumstances upon a neurotic?" "I have." "Do you still exclude the possibility of death by shock brought about by an attempt at hanging?" "Certainly. If she died immediately after the cutting down, the death would be due, not to shock, but to asphyxia from hanging." Spilsbury had offered one of his rare openings. Cassels was not the man to miss it. "You are presupposing, aren't you, that in all cases of hanging, death must be due to the hanging?" There can be little doubt that Spilsbury would have liked to recast his previous answer. But what he had said, he never shuffled, as he granted no favors, so he asked for none. "Yes," he replied. A scientist might conceivably endorse his attitude, but the average man intuitively dislikes presuppositions. The cross-examination neared its end without the slightest falling off in tension. The closing passages, fought out in the last minutes of the long spring afternoon, revolved around a point that bid fair to prove decisive. Were there signs of injury visible on the neck, such as one would expect from the tight grip of a cord? Spilsbury gave an unhesitating no. "On January 17th, when you performed your post-mortem, did you examine microscopically any part of the neck?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it was quite unnecessary. I made a thorough examination of the neck and found no mark." "Because externally you found no mark, you did not examine further?" "Oh yes," said Spilsbury. "Very much further." "But did you examine microscopically?" "No. I deeply probed the tissues." "By the naked eye?" Cassels insisted. "Yes." "Very well. On February 24th you were present at a further post-mortem conducted by 2 doctors who will be called for the defense?" "Yes." "Was a section taken of the neck on this occasion?" "Yes." "Did you have a part of that section for the purpose of microscopic examination?" "I did." "And a part was retained by the other doctors?" "Yes." "Slides would have to be made of them?" "Yes." The defense doctors, sitting close to counsel and following every word, framed the next question in their minds before it had been asked. Did not microscopic examination definitely show extravasation of blood, consistent only with pressure? No. Spilsbury spoke in uncompromising terms. There was no extravasation to be seen, he said. Indeed, Water had by then so soaked the tissues that all the elements of blood had been destroyed. Here the very heart of the matter had been reached. If Spilsbury was cocksure, the rest were cocksure too. They believed they could see extravasation in their slides, and were waiting their turn to say so upon oath. The duel between Spilsbury and Castles ended with honors even. Gains and losses on either side were small. Conflict remained on every major point, and in some cases was sharpened. But Castles at least had cleared and mapped the ground for the group of doctors he was going to call. They were eminent men, these doctors, rich in distinctions and respected by their colleagues. One was director of the pathological department at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Another, formerly professor at Glasgow University, was a medical legal examiner for the Crown. A third, as Crown analyst for the government in Dublin, had been for many years the Spilsbury of Ireland. All of them were practicing pathologists. All of them were adept in the use of slides. They were as definite in saying that there was extravasation as Spilsbury was definite in saying that there was not. Nor did a consultation held outside court hours, at which the rival experts met and examined each other's slides, shake them any more in their opinion than it shook Sir Bernard Spilsbury in his. Count the three as one, and you still had a stalemate. But trials, unlike chess, are not determined mathematically. There was one name in the four the jury knew. To them, the rest were as remote and strange as Einstein would be to a Hottentot. Spilsbury had spoken, and the idol, though at times hard-pressed, had not been dethroned. Long before the defense experts were heard, even as Spilsbury stepped down from the box, the sensitive in court could tell which way the wind was blowing. But there was still a chance for Thorne to be his own salvation. A prisoner in the box has curious powers which sometimes cancel out all other evidence. Let him but seem a worthy, decent man, let him appear a chap just like ourselves. And whatever the evidence on the charge preferred, a jury will be glad to wipe the record clean. Thorne was in the box almost the whole of the third day. By academic tests, he was an admirable witness. He wooed the jury with the common touch. He challenged them with unexpected frankness. I absolutely lost my head and became frantic. I was trembling from head to foot and broke into a cold perspiration. I flung myself on the bed and cried like a baby. And again, I was trying to build up evidence. I was trying to assume a role of knowing nothing about it. I did not go for help as I should have done, and consequently I had to go forward as I did. One says he wooed them, and he challenged them, but neither was necessarily the result of conscious art. It might have been the overwhelming impact of the truth. Thorne labored, however, under two great disadvantages which were inherent in the substance of his case. He was forced to proclaim himself a fluent, brazen liar, who could act and live as well as speak his lies. He was forced to recite a fearful inventory of horrors which would arouse more repugnance than homicide itself. These were matters that refused to be forgotten. Thorne himself was their unwilling memorial. As they heard him tell his story with a host of vivid touches, the simplest would recall a different, earlier tale, equally credible and equally embellished with plausible minutiae, such as letters to the dead. As they watched him in the witness box, so suave and almost gentle, the stolidest would conjure up a different earlier scene. The darkened hut, the active crouching man, the body of the girl stretched out stark naked on the floor, the hacksaw flashing over neck and limbs, the whole ghastly tableau lit to a dim red by the glow and flicker of the tiny fire. If a man had told such clever lies before, could he not tell such clever lies again? If a man was capable of dismembering his sweetheart, was there anything from which he would recoil? Whatever chance Thorne had was lost in cross-examination. Curtis Bennett stood out as a master of this art. Without bluster, bullying, or other resort of the third rate, he exerted a singular authority and power. He relied on the one legitimate weapon of a cross-examiner, the form and arrangement of the questions that he put. Because his skill in this respect fell not far short of genius, he secured his objects with the minimum of words. The first 4 questions he addressed to Thorne were typical of his method and his gifts. Curtis Bennett's aim was to elicit an admission that, by the day of Elsie Cameron's death, Thorne had transferred his affections to the other girl. It was not a matter of concrete fact, readily ascertainable, but a delicate inquiry into a state of mind. If the question had been baldly put without due preparation, Thorne would have been free to answer as he pleased. Now consider the technique that Curtis Bennett used not to trap him into falsehood, but to force him into truth. On the morning of December 5th, were you still in love with Elsie Cameron? To answer no would be to furnish forthwith superabundant evidence of motive. Thorne answered, yes. On the morning of December 5th, were you in love with the other girl? This was more tricky. To answer no would be immediately expedient. But there was his first statement to Gillen lying convenient to Sir Henry's hand. Almost every night from the middle of November, she came to my hut. We had during this time gradually fallen in love. It was no use flying in the face of that. Again, Thorne answered, yes. On that morning, which of these 2 girls that you were in love with did you desire to marry? I do not know I was particularly desirous of marrying any just at that time. The evasion served to gain only a few seconds. Curtis Bennett's next question slammed and locked the door. Which did you intend to marry in the future? Which did he intend to marry in the future? If he said Elsie, there were his letters registering reluctance. You seem to take everything for granted. If he said neither, he would convict himself at once of double-dyed and callous caddishness in inducing both girls onto terms of intimacy without intending to play fair with either. Well, he said, of the 2, I suppose I thought more of the other girl. 4 questions only, and each of them as compact as it was clear. A less accomplished cross-examiner might have asked 400 without obtaining such a definite result. The rest of this truly searching cross-examination bore the same hallmark of precise economy. There was, for example, the so-called Piper incident. A Mrs. Piper of Crowborough, with whom Elsie had often lodged, had been called as a witness for the Crown. She had told Cassels how one night Elsie refused to go to bed, and appearing stupefied, not normal, insisted on going back to Thorne, from whose farm she had just returned after being there all day. The defense dilated on the Piper incident to support their contention that Elsie was neurotic. Curtis Bennett sought to alter the motif from mental instability to passionate affection. It took him barely a dozen questions. Certainly, after you were engaged, he said to Thorne. Elsie Cameron was deeply in love with you, wasn't she? Yes. And being deeply in love with you, she was anxious to be with you as much as she could? Yes. And may I take it that you were very pleased to see her too at that time? Oh, yes, Thorne answered promptly. So often the form of Curtis Bennett's questions practically determined the reply. This incident when she was staying with Mrs. Piper, at that time was she deeply in love with you? Yes, passionately. Upon that particular day, she had spent the day with you? Yes. And you had been very happy together? Oh, yes. She had then been engaged to you for about 9 or 10 months? Yes. She left you about 10:30 at night. You took her back to Mrs. Piper, and then she insisted on coming back to you to spend the night? Yes. Prior to that, you had been intimate, had you not? Oh, yes. The purpose of this questioning was not to ferret out new facts, but to create a new atmosphere round facts that had already been established. Curtis Bennett did this again with certain variants when he came to inquire about the reasons for dismemberment. When you made up your mind to dismember the body, was it because you were afraid that somebody might think that you had murdered her? Not necessarily so. Used in such a context, the word necessarily implies some hidden reservation. I want to know, Curtis Bennett said. It must have been some very strong impulse which would make you, there and then, dismember the body. What was it? I cannot really explain, Thorne said. My desire was to hide it, not to dismember it. You had got nothing to be ashamed of? No. What was it that made you do it? I suppose, as I've already explained, realizing the position I was in, I was desirous of hiding her body, lest I should be blamed for having caused her death by any means. The last phrase showed that Thorne still hoped to steer clear of full surrender. I do not want there to be any misunderstanding, said Curtis Bennett calmly. For having caused her death. You mean for having murdered her? Through any means. Thorne clung to his straw stubbornly. Again, a key question fell neatly into place. Did you want to hide the fact that she had committed suicide? No, Thorne answered. I thought they would perhaps think that she had not committed suicide. Then it was because you thought they might imagine you had murdered her. Yes, said Thorne reluctantly. It had taken a little time to get round to it, but they were there now. The cross-examination was over, but before he returned to the immunity of the dock, there was still one last ordeal in store for Thorne. Mr. Justice Finley, biting his pen abstractedly and puckering his face, detained the prisoner a moment longer in the box. Just one or two questions, Thorne. There is room for a monograph on the one or two questions that judges have from time to time asked in similar circumstances, and which, coming with the weight of intervention from above, exercise immeasurable influence. Any such monograph would naturally begin with Darling's interrogation of the poisoner Armstrong, and perhaps follow up with Avery's inquisition of Frederick Guy Brown. Finley resembled neither of these judges. He had not Darling's hard and lacquered surface, nor Avery's reserve of cold remorselessness. He was a genial, kindly, unaffected man, who spoke in a mild and almost diffident way, but his questioning of Thorne could hardly have been more deadly. When you came back to the hut, Thorne, your first act was to cut Miss Cameron down. Yes, my lord. Did you make any attempt to resuscitate her? No, I thought she was dead. Did you ever think of going to fetch a doctor? Not until after I got up from the table. That was about an hour later. I should think it was about an hour. Then came 3 short, sharp, and paralyzing blows. You never thought of fetching a doctor at once on the chance of her being revived? No, I thought at once she was dead. You have heard, I suppose, that people who are apparently dead are sometimes revived? Yes, I have heard of such things. But you never thought of getting a doctor, and you did not get one. No. The judge bit his pen again and nodded a dismissal. There was an eloquent closing speech by Cassels, a massive reply by Curtis Bennett, a careful, thorough summing up by Finley, perfectly fair but not disguising his own belief that the Crown case had been proved. At 12 minutes past 5 on the 5th day, the jury withdrew, and at 20 minutes to 6 returned to pronounce the prisoner guilty. Many murder appeals are devoid of substance. Few have any real hope of success. But Norman Thorne's application for leave to appeal at least raised a novel and interesting point. The Criminal Appeal Act of 1907, which, among other things, founded the Court of Criminal Appeal, provides that where any question arising on appeal involves scientific investigation or expert knowledge, either it may be referred to a special commissioner for inquiry and report, or else a skilled assessor may be appointed to assist the court. Although the best part of 2 decades had passed, these powers had never previously been invoked. It was the defense's argument on appeal that they precisely fitted a case like Norman Thorne's. The bruises, the neck marks, the state of Elsie Cameron's nerves and mind were all put forward as proper subjects for the special procedure which the act envisaged. There was much to be said for the defense's proposition. The whole trial may have turned on the interpretation of a slide showing a fragment of the skin of a person 3 months dead. Expert 1 looks at his slide and says he can see nothing. Expert 2 looks at his and says he can see something. And the something he can see is extravasation of blood. Expert 1 looks at the slide of Expert 2 and says, ah yes, He sees what the other means. There is something there, but it is not extravasation. It is the degenerated remains of some sebaceous glands. Is any layman competent to judge between them? Should any man's life be at the mercy of such a judgment? If there could ever be a case for a commissioner or assessor, was it not the case that now occupied the court? How a commissioner would have reported, or an assessor advised, is a point which can only offer material for conjecture. They were never given an opportunity to show. The appeal court of 3 judges, 2 of whom were not among the ablest, dismissed the application without calling on the Crown. The usual petition was presented and refused, and in due course, like his jilted love, Thorne died a violent death. No one now will ever know what happened in Thorne's living hut that winter evening many years ago. Did he, as the jury evidently believed, willfully murder Elsie Cameron to avoid the unwelcome necessity of marriage and free himself for pursuit of a new passion? Or was there a struggle when he tried to leave the hut, with this dreadful but unpremeditated consequence? Or, and this is the most terrible alternative, did Thorne in the last resort speak nothing but the truth? One thing alone is certain. However, Elsie Cameron died. It was Thorne who slashed and hacked her corpse and cunningly concealed the severed fragments. Assuming that this had never been found out, one is tempted to speculate on what he meant to do. Perhaps, after a decent lapse of time, he would have gone abroad and lost his identity in some far-off land. Perhaps he would have wed the other girl and moved from his farm to less evocative surroundings. Perhaps he would have stayed on where he was, feeding his chickens, attending Sunday school, and sleeping sound and dreamlessly at night, while Elsie mouldered in the quiet earth. Any and every course would have required a heart of marble and a nerve of steel. Both these attributes were possessed by Thorne, as he had proved in the weeks before arrest. It is this inhuman streak in the man's character that bedevils assessment of the evidence and makes him one of the most baffling of all convicted murderers.